April 16, 1945. Dawn broke gray and heavy over eastern Berlin. In the suburbs, women stood frozen in ration queues, clutching thin cards that promised food that might never come. They listened. From somewhere beyond the horizon came a sound unlike anything they had heard before. Not the familiar whistle of Allied bombers, but something deeper, continuous, rolling toward them like distant thunder. Windows began to rattle in their frames. Plaster dust fell from ceiling cracks. Telephones rang on their own, vibrating from the tremors in the earth. Some whispered in dread that the Soviets were finally coming. Others clung to desperate hope, praying that American forces would arrive first, that Eisenhower's men, rather than Stalin's, would liberate them. On rooftops across the eastern districts, civilians had already painted white flags, crude symbols of surrender, visible from the air. The thunder grew louder. What those Berliners heard was not a storm. It was the single greatest artillery bombardment ever unleashed on German soil. Nearly 9,000 Soviet guns, as many as 270 crammed into every kilometer of front, had opened fire along the Oder-Neisse line. In just one day, 1.2 million shells rained down on the German defenders. More shells in 24 hours than some entire Western Front campaigns had expended in weeks. 7 million shells had been stockpiled for this operation alone. The earth itself seemed to tear apart. The final and most devastating battle of the war in Europe had begun. The Red Army had paused briefly after securing East Prussia, bringing forward supplies and reinforcements. Now Stalin gave the order to strike. Nothing mattered more to him than taking Berlin before the Americans and British. This was not merely about prestige or military victory. This was revenge. Revenge for Moscow, for Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for every village burned, for every family destroyed, for every mother who would never see her son again. Berlin would pay in full. On April 1st in Moscow, Stalin had called in his two most famous commanders. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev stood before him in the Kremlin. Who will take Berlin? Stalin asked them, his voice cold and measured. Us or the Allies? Marshal Konev, commanding the First Ukrainian Front, did not hesitate. We will, before the Allies. Stalin smiled, though the expression carried no warmth. So that is the sort of man you are. Orders were issued immediately. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front would attack from the north and center. Konev's armies would strike from the south. Together they would close a colossal pincer around Germany's capital. The scale of the force Stalin assembled was without precedent in human history. 2.5 million men, over 41,000 guns and rocket launchers, more than 6,000 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, the largest army ever assembled, now aimed at a single city. By 1945, the Red Army had become a war machine forged in blood and bitter experience. The T-34 tanks were reliable, powerful, easier to maintain than most German models. Artillery remained the Soviet god of war, and infantry worked together with armor in coordinated assaults that combined speed, aggression, and seemingly endless reserves. The Soviets no longer relied merely on numbers. They had learned how to fight, how to maneuver, how to overwhelm. Yet cracks remained beneath the surface. Ammunition was abundant, but food, uniforms, and spare parts were scarce. Many soldiers were gaunt, ordered to live off the land as they advanced into Germany. Much of their transport fuel, even their rations, came from America, supplied under Lend-Lease agreements. Soviet commanders were hardened veterans, but discipline in the ranks was brutal and uneven. Despite the presence of political officers, looting and rape were rife. Years of propaganda had convinced many soldiers that Germany was not only to be defeated, but disgraced. For them, Berlin was not just the final prize. It was the place where vengeance would be unleashed without mercy. Marshal Zhukov's assault was meant to be the centerpiece of the battle for Berlin. The man praised as the general who never lost a battle approached this fight with uncharacteristic clumsiness. At the silo, he could not attack, even under threat of execution. On the evening of April 22nd, Hitler dismissed Lieutenant General Helmuth Reimann as Berlin's commander and bizarrely promoted a little-known officer, Colonel Ernst Kather, straight to lieutenant general. By the next day, the appointment was canceled, leaving Berlin with no commander at all as Soviet forces entered the suburbs. Zhukov's men reached Oranienburg, where they liberated hundreds of French prisoners who immediately waved tricolor flags and began marching west toward freedom. Konev's troops tightened the southern ring, advancing to the Teltow Canal. There, a massive Wehrmacht ration depot stood on the north bank. Exhausted soldiers begged for food, only to be refused by the administrator because the proper paperwork had not been completed. Instead, he set fire to the storehouses, destroying what could have fed thousands. As Soviet forces pushed deeper, they began combing through civilians, uncovering disguised German soldiers. The wave of looting and rape began in earnest. Homes were stripped of furniture, bedding, even light bulbs. Women faced the full violence of Soviet vengeance. That same day, 2 councils of war took place. General Helmuth Weidling gathered his officers, who all pleaded for permission to break out. Some hoped to link up with the shattered Ninth Army. Others, like the Nordland Division, hoped to reach the Steiner in the north. But there was no escape. Weidling's men were at the breaking point. Filthy, hollow-eyed, unshaven soldiers who had not tasted their iron rations in over a week. They scavenged abandoned houses for tins of pork and stale bread. The Ninth Army fared no better. Its men wandered in small groups, out of fuel and out of order. Communications were so broken that even Army Group Vistula no longer knew where the front line was. That afternoon, Hitler demanded news of Steiner's counterattack. When told none had occurred, he erupted in a rage. Before his terrified staff, Hitler ranted that the war was lost. He declared that he would stay in Berlin and kill himself rather than surrender. It was his most violent outburst yet, shaking even those accustomed to his tantrums. Goebbels, summoned to the bunker, declared his loyalty and moved his wife and 6 children into the underground shelter to share Hitler's fate. By evening, Hitler calmed himself and clung to yet another fantasy. He ordered General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, positioned on the Elbe against the Americans, to disengage and march northeast to rescue Berlin. It was impossible, but written orders were drawn up. Many in Hitler's circle seized the moment to abandon the capital, escaping south in what they called Operation Seraglio. Secretaries, aides, and doctors fled by air to Berchtesgaden, while others began burning Hitler's personal papers. Even as shells pounded the city above, the bunker below remained stocked with fine food and alcohol. The mood turned to drunken resignation. Discipline evaporated. Everyone knew the war would end only with Hitler's suicide. On April 23rd, Soviet bombardment intensified. The Red Army brought up colossal 600-millimeter siege guns and turned them on Berlin's massive flak towers. These concrete giants still sheltered thousands of civilians who had already lost their homes. Amid the terror, a diarist noted the grim, everyday horrors. A deserter hanged from the entrance of an U-Bahn tunnel, his corpse twisted by boys for sport. The same diarist, scouring for coal, stumbled upon soft-faced children under huge steel helmets, so tiny and thin in uniforms far too large for them. To her, this grotesque sight of children in oversized uniforms was nothing less than abuse. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel personally delivered Hitler's written order to General Walter Wenck: attack east and liberate Berlin. Wenck knew the command was madness. His 12th Army had been positioned to face the Americans, not to march back into the inferno. His men were exhausted, his supplies nearly depleted. Yet orders were orders. Wenck began the impossible march toward Berlin, knowing full well that his army would arrive too late, if it arrived at all, Inside Berlin, the fighting grew more desperate with each passing hour. Soviet troops pushed into the outer suburbs, moving from house to house, block by block. German defenders fought from cellars, attics, and shattered apartment buildings. Every street corner became a battleground, every building a potential fortress or tomb. The Soviets brought up artillery to blast through barricades, then sent infantry rushing through the smoke and dust. German machine gunners fired until their ammunition ran out, then retreated to the next position, only to repeat the process again. The Hitler Youth, first armed with their Panzerfausts, crouched in rubble-filled gardens and behind burned-out vehicles. Some were brave, some were terrified, all were children. They watched Soviet tanks rumble past, waiting for the moment to fire. Some succeeded, knocking out a T-34 with a single shot. Others were cut down before they could pull the trigger. Their bodies lay among the debris, still clutching weapons they had barely learned to use. Civilians trapped in the city huddled in cellars and air raid shelters, listening to the thunder of artillery and the rattle of machine gun fire above. Water was scarce. Food was scarcer. The smell of smoke, cordite, and death permeated everything. Families shared what little they had, rationing crumbs of bread and sips of murky water. Mothers tried to comfort children who no longer understood why the world was ending. In the darkness, they waited, not knowing if the next shell would bring the ceiling down upon them. On April 24th, the Soviet encirclement of Berlin was complete. The ring had closed, no supplies could enter, no reinforcements could arrive. The city was cut off from the rest of Germany, an island surrounded by a sea of Soviet forces. Inside that shrinking perimeter, over 2 million civilians and perhaps 100,000 German soldiers remained trapped in a cauldron of fire and steel. Hitler continued to issue orders from his bunker as if commanding armies that still existed. He spoke of relief columns and counteroffensives, of divisions that would break through and save the capital. His generals nodded, their faces blank, knowing that nothing he said bore any relation to reality. Some still hoped for a miracle, clinging to the propaganda they had repeated for so long. Others had already accepted the inevitable. The war was lost. Berlin was lost. All that remained was how and when it would end. The SS Nordland Division, still fighting in the eastern districts, was gradually pushed back toward the city center. The Frenchmen of the Charlemagne Division fought alongside them, knowing that capture meant death. These foreign volunteers had burned their bridges long ago. There was no going home, no surrender, only the choice of how to die. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. By April 25th, Soviet forces reached the Landwehr Canal in the heart of Berlin. The city was being cut into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. Communication between the German units broke down almost completely. Commanders made decisions based on guesswork and rumor. Some units fought on because they received no orders to withdraw. Others fought because they feared what would happen if they stopped. A few fought because they still believed in something, though what that something was had become unclear. That same day, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River near Torgau, far to the west of Berlin. The link-up was celebrated with handshakes and toasts, soldiers from two armies meeting in the middle of a defeated Germany. But in Berlin, the meeting meant nothing. The Americans were not coming. Berlin would be a Soviet prize, paid for in Soviet blood. Wenck's 12th Army pushed eastward, but made agonizingly slow progress. Soviet forces intercepted and harassed his columns. His men fought through exhaustion, knowing they were marching into a trap. Wenck managed to establish a narrow corridor, allowing some refugees and wounded soldiers to escape westward. But reaching Berlin itself was impossible. The city was beyond saving. Inside the bunker, Hitler's world had shrunk to a handful of rooms beneath the rubble. He held his final military conferences, moving phantom divisions on maps that no longer reflected reality. He raged at generals who had failed him, at soldiers who had betrayed him, at a world that refused to bend to his will. On April 28th, he learned that Heinrich Himmler had attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies. Hitler's fury was absolute. Himmler, the loyal Heinrich, had betrayed him. It was the final confirmation that everything had collapsed. On April 29th, Soviet forces were mere blocks from the Reich Chancellery. The sound of gunfire echoed through the bunker's concrete walls. Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony, then dictated his political testament, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party, appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and prepared for the end. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the government district above, Adolf Hitler retreated to his private quarters with Eva Braun. The details of what happened next are well known. Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took poison. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The flames consumed them as Soviet shells continued to fall. Joseph Goebbels remained in the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children. The next day, May 1st, Magda Goebbels poisoned her children one by one as they slept. Then Joseph and Magda went up to the garden where SS guards shot them both. Their bodies too were burned, though not as thoroughly as Hitler's. The leadership of the Third Reich had ended in fire and suicide in a ruined garden beneath a city consumed by war. But the fighting continued. German soldiers and SS men who did not know Hitler was dead kept fighting. Some units attempted to break out toward the west, hoping to reach American lines. Most were cut down or captured. The Nordland Division made a final stand near the Reichstag, fighting until their ammunition was exhausted. Then they surrendered or died where they stood. On May 2nd, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling, now appointed by Hitler's successors as the commandant of Berlin, ordered a ceasefire. The Battle of Berlin was over. Weidling surrendered to the Soviets, and German resistance in the city collapsed. White flags appeared in windows. Soldiers emerged from cellars with their hands raised. The guns fell silent. The cost had been staggering. Soviet forces suffered over 80,000 dead and nearly 300,000 wounded in the battle for Berlin alone. German military casualties are harder to calculate, but estimates suggest at least 125,000 dead, many of them old men and teenage boys who should never have been in uniform. Civilian deaths in Berlin during the final weeks of the war numbered at least 125,000, perhaps more. Many died in the bombardment. Others were killed in the street fighting. Still others died in the chaos that followed the Soviet occupation. The physical destruction was total. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Historic buildings, centuries old, lay in ruins. Streets were choked with debris, burned out vehicles, and the bodies of the dead. It would take years, decades even, to rebuild what had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. For the soldiers who fought in Berlin, the battle left scars that never healed. Soviet veterans spoke of the grinding, brutal nature of urban combat, of clearing buildings, room by room, of the constant fear of ambush. German survivors, those who lived through the battle, carried the trauma of defending a city that could not be defended, of watching their world collapse around them. For the civilians, the ordeal was even worse. They had endured years of bombing, then weeks of artillery bombardment, then days of street fighting in their neighborhoods, and when the fighting stopped, they faced occupation, hunger, and the long, difficult work of survival in a destroyed city. The Battle of Berlin was the final act of the European theater of World War II, but it was not a glorious victory or a heroic last stand. It was brutal, ugly, and unnecessary. By April 1945, Germany had already lost the war. The outcome was certain. But pride, ideology, and the momentum of violence carried the fighting to its bitter conclusion. Tens of thousands died for a city that could not be saved, for a regime that had already collapsed, for a war that was already over. The battle holds a grim place in history because it shows what happens when war is fought beyond all reason. When surrender is refused and destruction is embraced, it shows the cost of fanaticism, the price of delusion, the horror of urban warfare at its worst. Berlin in April and May 1945 was hell on earth, a vision of what war becomes when all restraint is abandoned. Today, the traces of that battle can still be found in Berlin. Bullet holes score the walls of surviving buildings. Monuments mark where the fiercest fighting occurred. Museums preserve the artifacts and tell the stories. But the true legacy of the Battle of Berlin is not found in stone or bronze. It is found in the lives that were lost, the futures that were stolen, the suffering that was endured. When remembering the Battle of Berlin, remember the children pressed into uniform, the civilians trapped in cellars, the soldiers on all sides who died in streets far from home. Remember the madness that led to such carnage, the choices that made such horror possible. Remember not to glorify, but to understand. Remember so that such a battle never happens again. The Battle of Berlin was worse than most imagine because it was not just a military engagement. It was the culmination of years of total war, the final expression of an ideology built on violence and conquest. It was the moment when all the cruelty, all the destruction, all the waste of war converged on a single city. And in that convergence, something beyond military defeat occurred. Humanity itself seemed to break, if only for a moment, in those burning streets. The world that emerged from the ruins of Berlin was forever changed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, when Germany signed its unconditional surrender. But the scars of Berlin, like the scars of the entire war, would take generations to heal. The city would be divided, becoming a symbol of the Cold War that followed. Germany would be split, occupied, transformed. The world would reckon with the full horror of what had been done in the name of ideology and empire. But none of that reckoning could undo what happened in Berlin in the spring of 1945. The dead remained dead. The destroyed remained destroyed. The suffering remained in the memories of those who lived through it. The Battle of Berlin stands as a reminder of where war leads when it is pursued to its absolute end, when every alternative is rejected, when destruction becomes an end in itself. If this story has moved you, if these names and faces and moments of courage and horror have touched something within you, then remember them. Share this story. Keep alive the memory of what happened when a city became a battlefield and humanity was tested in fire. For in remembering and bearing witness to the past, there remains the hope that such battles, such suffering, such waste need never happen again. The Battle of Berlin was worse than we imagine because war itself, stripped of illusion, is always worse than we imagine. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is, must never be forgotten. Heights where German troops had dug in along their last natural barrier east of the capital, Zhukov attempted something bold. He ordered 143 powerful searchlights placed every 200 meters along the front. The plan was to illuminate the battlefield at the moment of attack and blind the German defenders. But when the beams snapped on in the pre-dawn darkness, the effect was catastrophic. Instead of blinding the Germans, the glare reflected off the thick smoke and dust kicked up by the bombardment. German gunners, rather than being confused, instantly zeroed in on the light sources. Artillery fire smashed many of the positions, killing dozens of the mostly female operators before the infantry had even begun to advance. The searchlights, meant to be Zhukov's masterstroke, became a disaster. Opposing Zhukov stood one of Germany's most brilliant defensive commanders, Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, the son of a Lutheran pastor and married to a woman of partial Jewish descent. Heinrici was far from the image of a fanatical Nazi general. What kept him in uniform was his unrivaled ability to hold a defensive line against overwhelming odds. In April 1945, he commanded Army Group Vistula, the last shield guarding the Oder approaches to Berlin. On paper, Heinrici controlled nearly 1 million men, but this figure was a cruel illusion. It included training units scraped together from barracks at Jetty, police detachments pulled from city streets, and Hitler youth boys barely old enough to shave. He had access to around 10,000 tanks, 1,500 heavy guns, and some 3,300 aircraft. Yet most of this equipment sat idle, crippled by fuel shortages, lack of ammunition, or missing spare parts. The German war machine was exhausted. Tanks sat silent in forests empty of fuel. Artillery crews rationed shells, firing only when targets were certain. Many soldiers had gone unpaid for months. Morale collapsed further, with every refugee column streaming west, with every letter from home reporting destruction and Soviet occupation. Still they fought, some out of blind loyalty to Hitler, others because they feared what surrender to the Soviets would mean. Among the most determined were the foreign SS volunteers. The 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Nordland, made up of Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, held firm to the last. Alongside them stood Frenchmen of the 33rd SS Charlemagne Division, who knew that capture meant certain execution or treason trials back in Paris. Even a handful of renegade Britons stood among them. The 50 or so men of the so-called British Free Corps, distrusted even by the Germans they served under. Despite shortages, the Germans retained certain strengths: quick-thinking field officers, the ability to regroup under fire, heavy Tiger tanks armed with their lethal 88mm guns. Even in the spring of 1945, German forces could still deliver punishing blows when circumstances aligned. Other forces drove them to resist. Goebbels flooded the airwaves with promises of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. Soldiers feared for their families if the Soviets broke through. SS roving courts-martial patrolled the rear areas, hanging anyone suspected of desertion. In Berlin, even whispers of retreat could mean a rope around the neck, but the reality facing Heinrici was grim. His lines at the Nese and the Silo Heights were not held by the well-equipped legions that had conquered Europe in 1940. They were patched together from naval crews stripped from idle ships, Luftwaffe pilots without planes, and cadets pulled from military schools. The rest were Volkssturm, old men, and teenage boys, dragged from their neighborhoods, given armbands, and handed a Panzerfaust launcher instead of a rifle. Many had no uniforms, little training, and no chance against the largest army in history bearing down on them. With Heinrici's defenses dug in, Zhukov launched his main assault on the Silo Heights. At first, fortune seemed to favor the Germans. Beyond the disaster of the searchlights, overcast skies and heavy rain made conditions miserable for both sides. The Soviet shelling was nevertheless horrific. Hitler youth and raw recruits, many fighting their first battle, mistook the opening barrage for the usual morning concert of artillery fire. The veterans knew better. The long-awaited storm had begun. Gerd Wagner of the 27th Parachute Regiment recalled that within seconds of the barrage opening, all 10 of his comrades were dead. Wagner himself woke up half-buried in a smoking shell crater, dazed and alone, barely able to crawl to safety. In another sector, an SS Panzer battalion commander scanned through his periscope and saw the entire eastern horizon glowing as if it were on fire. The bombardment tore up the ground and shattered morale. An SS war correspondent encountered a dazed soldier wandering in the woods who had thrown away his rifle. The man admitted this was his first day on the Eastern Front. Until then, he had been a barber in a Paris officer's hotel, Now he had been pitched straight into hell. Even with such devastation, Zhukov's men struggled to make headway. Soviet infantry attempted to cross the Oder in American-supplied DUK-DLRs, amphibious vehicles driven by female soldiers. Behind them came every type of craft imaginable, from motor launches to leaking rowboats, all trying to ferry men into the firestorm. Under relentless German fire, the Soviets stumbled ashore only to hit dense minefields. Progress was agonizingly slow. By midday, their advance had bogged down in deep mud, littered with wrecked vehicles and bodies. German fortunes were no better. Goebbels tried to rally the nation with a radio broadcast insisting that the Mongol hordes would smash themselves to pieces against Germany's walls. Berliners were unconvinced. They could read maps. The queues outside food shops grew longer as civilians rushed to stockpile whatever they could before the Soviets arrived. Heinrici wanted to counterattack, but Hitler intervened. In one of his increasingly delusional decisions, he stripped Heinrici of 3 vital panzer divisions and sent them south to Czechoslovakia, chasing fantasies of a counterstroke there. At the high command bunkers in Zossen, Chief of Staff Hans Krebs struggled to maintain communication with collapsing front lines, nervously downing shots of vermouth from the bottle he kept in his office safe. At noon on April 16th, Zhukov, growing frustrated, hurled in his tanks, but these too floundered. They were easy prey for German Panzerfaust teams, choked in the mud and snarled in chaotic traffic jams at the bridgeheads. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation was so dire that Zhukov himself had to call Stalin. The Soviet leader was unimpressed. "So, you underestimated the enemy on the approaches to Berlin?" Stalin said coldly. "You're still stuck on the Silo Heights. Things have gone better for Konev." Furious, Zhukov roared at his army commanders, who in turn bellowed down the line at their subordinates, demanding fresh attacks regardless of the cost. Chaos reigned across the battlefield. Soviet aircraft, misled by the wrong-colored signal flares, bombed their own advancing troops. Artillery batteries shelled their own men. Medical services were completely overwhelmed. Thousands of wounded lay untended for hours. The 27th Guards Rifle Division's casualty clearing station had just 4 operating tables for hundreds of cases. Some medics were so traumatized by the carnage that after the war they abandoned the medical profession entirely. While Zhukov struggled on the Silo Heights, Marshal Ivan Konev's attack unfolded with far greater success. His plan was brutal in its simplicity: crush the German defenses with overwhelming firepower. Along his sector, 249 guns were packed into every kilometer, even more concentrated than Zhukov had used. For 145 minutes, nearly 2.5 hours, the guns in the Second Air Army hammered the German lines, twice the length of Zhukov's bombardment. Instead of searchlights, Konev employed a dense smoke screen to conceal his assault troops. The results were catastrophic for the Germans. Corporal Karl Pavlek, captured after the barrage, recalled the horror. "We had nowhere to hide. The air was full of whistling and explosions. We suffered unimaginable losses. Those who survived were rushing around in trenches and bunkers trying to save themselves. We were speechless with terror." On the Soviet side, one battery commander was exultant. "The god of war is thundering very nicely today," he declared. The Neisse River offered less protection than the Oder. In places it was so shallow that Soviet infantry waded across or swam with rifles held above their heads. The moment they reached the far bank, 85mm anti-tank guns were dragged over to provide immediate fire support. The sheer weight of Konev's bombardment shattered German morale. Desertion spread quickly. And one soldier from the 500th Penal Regiment told his Soviet captors bitterly, "The only promise Hitler has kept is the one he made before coming to power. Give me 10 years and you will not recognize Germany." Others muttered that their officers had deceived them with false promises of miracle weapons, the so-called V3 and V4 rockets that never arrived. Once cables were secured across the river, Soviet engineers ferried T-34 tanks across, their 85-millimeter guns ready to blast open strongpoints. The first Ukrainian front had chosen 133 crossing points across the Gneiss, ensuring the assault unfolded on a broad, crushing scale. By nightfall, Konev was satisfied with his progress, while his rival Zhukov fumed at his own lack of results. That evening at 9 o'clock, Stalin issued fresh orders. On his map of China, he drew a line from the Nesei River near Guben up through the town of Lublin, and then stopped. The message was obvious. The boundary between Zhukov and Konev was left deliberately open. Stalin had set his two greatest generals in direct competition. Whoever reached Berlin first would claim the prize and the glory. Thus began a race between two rivals. Zhukov was the better known, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander. He had crushed the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, saved Moscow in the winter of 1941, and helped turn the tide at Stalingrad in 1942. A former Fourier's apprentice and cavalry officer, he had become the face of Soviet victory. Konev, by contrast, had served in quieter assignments. He had not led men at Moscow or Stalingrad, but his aggressive style earned him command of the First Ukrainian Front and a reputation in the Kremlin as a hard-driving general who never hesitated to spend lives to achieve results. The next morning, skies over the Silo Heights cleared, and Zhukov renewed his assault. Once again, artillery and aircraft pounded the German positions. Casualties mounted so heavily that German medical stations collapsed under the strain. Triage was brutal. Only those most likely to return to combat received care. A stomach wound was effectively a death sentence. Surgery took too long. Doctors and nurses turned away the hopeless while officers prowled through the aid stations, sending the walking wounded straight back into the line. In the rear, military police, feared and hated, known as chain dogs, for the metal gorgets they wore around their necks, combed through columns of refugees, dragging out suspected deserters and stragglers. Many were forced back to the front and thrown into new scratch units. Among them were barely trained Hitler Youth, some only 15 years old, pressed into service with Panzerfausts slung over their shoulders. These children, alongside exhausted veterans and terrified conscripts, were now expected to hold back the largest army in history. Meanwhile, Zhukov's forces pressed relentlessly forward. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns turned on ground targets and infantry hunting tanks with Panzerfausts inflicted heavy losses. Yet the Soviets, through sheer weight and determination, gradually surrounded Silo. At the center of the German defense was the 9th Parachute Division, commanded by General Bruno Breuer, a veteran of Crete, remembered for chain-smoking cigarettes from a long holder. His division included a handful of hardened men who had once served in Otto Skorzany's commando units, but most were inexperienced Luftwaffe ground crews, barely trained for frontline combat. The 9th Division collapsed under the storm. On April 17th, one of its regimental commanders was killed outright. Panic swept through the ranks, and many of the Luftwaffe replacements broke and fled. Even Breuer himself cracked under the pressure. The Crete veteran suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be relieved of his command, leaving what remained of his division to fragment. The Germans attempted local counterattacks, but these too ended in tragedy. The 101st Corps, made up largely of officer cadets and teenage trainees, was thrown against Soviet armor. To their horror, they discovered that the enemy had lined the flanks of their tanks with wire-sprung mattresses, stripped from nearby houses. The Panzerfaust rockets bounced harmlessly off, and the cadets were cut down in droves. In the aftermath, the once proud Potsdam Regiment counted only 34 boys, still able to stand. False hopes only deepened the misery. Foreign Minister Joachim van Ribbentrop circulated a rumor that peace talks with the British were underway. Clinging to this fantasy, General Theodore Busse, commander of the Ninth Army, told his men, "Hold on for 2 more days, then everything will be sorted out." The lie gave them nothing but more time to die. Even the Luftwaffe resorted to suicidal measures. Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers were ordered to attack Soviet pontoon bridges across the Oder. 2 pilots, mortally wounded, deliberately crashed their planes into the structures in a last act of defiance. But the sacrifice was meaningless. The Soviets had already built 32 bridges across the river. Against such numbers, individual heroics or desperation could achieve nothing. Konev's armored spearheads pressed relentlessly forward, racing through burning pine forests and across lakes and marshes toward the Spree. All day, his tanks thundered northwest, cutting a path toward Berlin. That evening, when Konev reported to Stalin, the Soviet leader contrasted his progress with Zhukov's struggles. With Zhukov, things are not going so well yet. He is still breaking through the enemy defenses, Stalin noted, even suggesting that Zhukov should attack through Konev's bridgehead. Konev, sensing opportunity, offered to drive directly on Berlin himself. Stalin's reply was swift. "Very good, I agree. Turn the tank armies toward Berlin." The race was now official. Inside Berlin, the news of the Soviet offensive was accompanied by a storm of propaganda. Goebbels thundered over the airwaves, urging the population to resist to the last breath. "Any German who offends against this self-evident duty to the nation will lose his life as well as his honor," he warned. The words rang hollow. Everyone knew that the city was running on fumes. Heinrich's men were asked to hold out with tanks that had no fuel, guns with no shells, and troops surviving on dwindling rations. At dawn on April 18th, the eastern horizon glowed red as massive Soviet airstrikes and artillery fire opened another day of destruction. Zhukov, humiliated by Konev's rapid progress, threw his forces back into the attack. Once again, Soviet armor rolled forward into panzer ambushes, suffering heavily. But at 9:40 in the morning, the Red Army finally cracked the German lines. The shattered remnants of the 7th Panzer Division, once commanded by Rommel in its glory days, fell back in chaos. By mid-afternoon, the German Ninth Army itself was on the verge of being split in two. The Silo Heights had finally fallen, but at appalling cost. Zhukov lost some 30,000 men in the assault compared to around 12,000 German dead. In just 3 days, the Soviets had bled more men than the Allies had lost in the entire campaign for Normandy. The price of breaking through to Berlin was proof of the sheer brutality of this final battle. To the south, Konev's armored columns shrugged off a German counterattack on their flank and kept grinding westward. Resistance was weakening by the hour. For the Germans, desperation now dictated policy. Hitler ordered the Volkssturm in Berlin, poorly armed old men and boys, to be stripped from the city and sent to reinforce the collapsing Ninth Army. In reality, only 10 battalions and a few anti-aircraft batteries could be spared, leaving Berlin itself defended by little more than immobile flak guns. Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth, even went so far as to offer his 15-year-old boys to General Helmuth Weidling of the 56th Panzer Corps. Armed with Panzerfausts, they were to be thrown against Soviet tanks. Weidling was outraged, exploding at the idea of sending children into the slaughter. Axmann reluctantly withdrew the order, but the regime's madness only deepened. At Plötzensee prison in Berlin, the Gestapo executed 30 political prisoners in cold blood. Meanwhile, the Ninth Army itself was disintegrating. Its unit split in 3 directions under pressure. The 9th Parachute Division tried to regroup, but the paratroopers had nothing left. They abandoned the battlefield, handing over their remaining ammunition to the arriving men of the SS Nordland Division. On Reichstrasse 1, the main road leading east from Berlin, a tide of refugees streamed west, shouting to the oncoming SS troops, "Ivan is right behind us." The Nordland Division pushed east toward the front as the exhausted masses fled in the opposite direction. At roadblocks, SS men and military police searched for deserters. Anyone caught was hanged on the spot, often in front of the same refugees who had begged the SS for protection. The hypocrisy was staggering. Even as they executed others for desertion, the SS themselves were already making plans to retreat north to Schleswig-Holstein, where they hoped to surrender to the British instead of the Soviets. On April 19th, the highways became death traps. Soviet aircraft prowled overhead, striking relentlessly at anything that moved, civilian or military. Columns of refugees were torn apart alongside broken remnants of German units. The 101st Corps, made up of officer, cadets, and trainees, dissolved completely, abandoning their weapons in panic. Stragglers formed ad hoc battle groups, fighting briefly for a village or a crossroads before scattering again. It was the image of an army in total collapse, fighting in fragments while the Red Army closed in with unstoppable force. All the disasters unfolding at the front seemed to mean little to Adolf Hitler, now directing a war that was already lost from the depths of his bunker. Beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, there, surrounded by compliant generals and ever-loyal secretaries, he lived in a twilight world detached from reality. On April 20th, 1945, under clear skies, the Führer marked his 56th birthday, the last he would ever see. The day was interrupted by the next-to-last American air raid on Berlin. With the postal system collapsing, there were few gifts from the German people, but the Nazi elite gathered one final time to pay their respects. Hermann Göring arrived after abandoning his lavish country estate at Karrenhall. He had stripped it bare of priceless art treasures before ordering Luftwaffe engineers to rig it with explosives. Without looking back, he pressed the detonator, reducing his mansion to rubble, and then drove in his enormous car to Berlin to honor Hitler. The gathering in the bunker was more funeral than birthday. Aside from Goebbels and Hitler's personal secretary, Martin Bormann, most of the Nazi hierarchy were already plotting their escape. Göring planned to retreat to Bavaria, and Heinrich Himmler to Schleswig-Holstein, and Albert Speer to the mountains of southern Germany. Hitler accepted a sack of donations collected by ordinary soldiers, remarking only that it felt lighter than in years past. At the daily staff conference, the collapsing front was discussed in tones of resignation. Hitler declared he would remain in Berlin to share the fate of the capital. His subordinates quietly devised their own exit strategies. Later that day, he appeared in what would be his final newsreel, reviewing a detachment of Hitler Youth. The boys, some scarcely old enough to shave, had been awarded Iron Crosses for destroying Soviet tanks with Panzerfausts. The frail Führer, hiding his trembling left arm behind his back, walked slowly down the line, patting the children on the cheek, while medals were pinned to their tunics. That evening, deep underground, his mistress, Eva Braun, presided over a champagne party to celebrate his birthday. Outside Hitler's bunker, life in Berlin was collapsing. Housewives queued for hours, clutching ration cards, waiting for scraps of food, and the one-page newspaper Goebbels still managed to print. Even that was useless. Its reports used vague language to disguise where the fighting was taking place. That day, Berliners were told they would receive crisis rations of bacon, sausage, rice, peas, beans, and lentils. Few ever saw them. With water, gas, and electricity failing, families cooked half-rotten potatoes over makeshift stoves, 3 bricks propped on a balcony, with a handful of sticks for fuel. Offices shut down as shells and bombs made movement through the streets impossible. The entire city waited in dread for the end. By then, Zhukov's artillery had the range of Berlin itself. Shells began hammering into a capital already wrecked by years of air raids. To his tank armies, he gave the order, break into Berlin at first and raise the banner of victory. He wanted his guards to reach the city by dawn on April 21st. In reality, they did not arrive until later that afternoon, crawling forward through rubble and fire. South of him, Konev kept pressing his men through the Spreewald. His impatience boiled over. "You are again moving like a snail," he barked at one of his commanders, furious at the lack of speed. There was no longer a coherent front. What remained of the German Ninth Army fought scattered holding actions at Verneuken airfield. Gunners depressed their 88mm flak pieces to fire at ground targets, but the effort was futile. Roads to the west were jammed with columns of refugees. Weidling ordered the Nordland Division, now fighting side by side with Hitler Youth and remnants of the 18th Panzer Grenadiers, to counterattack. The effort collapsed. The Hitler Youth were trapped in a burning forest. The Germans fell back once more. In the chaos, a solitary King Tiger tank briefly turned the tide. It destroyed two T-34s with its 88mm gun, forcing the Soviets to halt and regroup. But such moments were fleeting. Nordland's Scandinavian nurses retreating with their men were caught in the slaughter. One young nurse discovered her lover among the mortally wounded and cradled his head in her lap until he died. German discipline disintegrated completely. Soldiers who had not eaten in days broke into abandoned houses, devouring whatever they found. Others collapsed into beds, boots still on, desperate for a few hours of sleep. One Hitler Youth boy slept soundly through an entire battle raging nearby. Officers tried to restore order at gunpoint. But even the SS flying courts-martial, once feared for their ruthlessness, were overwhelmed. Some execution squads themselves deserted. Soviet interrogators later recorded that as many as 40,000 deserters were already hiding inside Berlin before the Soviets broke in. The remnants of Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps pulled back again, falling into Berlin's western suburbs and linking up with the shattered 101st Corps along the city's northern edge. At Bernau, the Soviet 47th Army smashed through the last line of resistance before the capital. After firing a triumphant artillery salute, the 47th Army and 2nd Guards Tank Army drove inside the S-Bahn ring. The race for Berlin was over. Konev and Zhukov had arrived at the gates of the city, and the final storm was about to begin. By April 21st, Berlin itself was beginning to unravel. At the city's defense headquarters, a procession of high-ranking officials lined up, all demanding passes to escape before the capital was encircled. Goebbels had decreed that no man capable of bearing arms could leave Berlin without permission. The High Command were desperate to get out. Lieutenant General Helmuth Reimann, in charge of the city's defenses, gladly signed more than 2,000 passes. In a single day, eager to be rid of men he regarded as nothing but useless mouths and cowardly armchair warriors. That same morning, Berlin was struck by the final Allied air raid of the war. Almost immediately afterward, the first heavy shells from Soviet guns began falling into the heart of the city. Hitler, huddled in his bunker, could scarcely believe that the Red Army was now close enough to bombard central Berlin directly. The cost to civilians was immediate and brutal. Casualties mounted as Berliners queued for rations or water at street pumps. Simply crossing a road had become a gamble with death. Families buried their valuables in gardens and cellars, hoping the Soviets would not find them. The great institutions of Berlin shut down one by one. The German Trans-Ocean News Agency and Reich Radio Berlin went silent. The telegraph office closed its doors for the first time in a century. Its final message came from Tokyo. "Good luck to you all." Tempelhof Airport saw its last flight, a transport plane carrying 9 passengers who escaped to Stockholm. Berlin's 1,400 fire brigades were ordered to withdraw westward to save themselves for the post-war era. Gas, water, and electricity failed almost entirely. Only 2 operations carried on. The meteorological station in Potsdam continued to log the weather without interruption, and by decree, 11 of the city's 17 breweries remained at work, still producing beer for a collapsing Reich. But law and order dissolved. Hungry civilians turned to looting. Freight trains stalled in marshalling yards. Markets and department stores were broken open. People staggered away with armfuls of whatever food they could find, tins of apricots, sacks of beans, even chocolate. Shopkeepers sold off stock at fire sale prices, knowing money was already worthless, and the Soviets would plunder anything left behind. For those with nothing, survival meant cutting up the carcasses of dead horses that littered the streets. It was the last source of meat in a starving city, and families cooked it over brick stoves as the Soviet shells rained down. By now, Hitler was demanding the impossible. He ordered the Ninth Army to hold a line that no longer existed. While the 56th Panzer Corps retreated along roads littered with corpses from Soviet strafing runs, the Red Army moved to close its ring around Berlin, determined to crush the city before the Americans could intervene. Though the American advance had already halted at the Elbe, Stalin's paranoia convinced him that the Western Allies might try to seize the German capital at the last moment. On Berlin's eastern approaches, Zhukov's men prepared to strike south towards the Spree. To the south, Konev's tanks rolled into Zossen, the sacred nerve center of the German army. There they found the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht's underground headquarters, the Maybach bunkers almost completely intact. Generators still hummed, teleprinters clacked, and telephones rang, with incoming calls from officers unaware their front had already collapsed. When one German officer asked over the line, "What is happening?" the Soviet soldier who answered replied bluntly, "Ivan is here. Go to hell." Back in Berlin, Hitler pored over maps and issued orders that bore no connection to reality. He instructed the 3rd SS Panzer Corps to counterattack, ignoring the fact that the Corps existed only on paper. Hitler spoke of elite divisions and decisive blows, but in truth, General Felix Steiner commanded little more than 6 exhausted battalions cobbled together from fragments of the 4th SS Police Division, the 5th Panzer Division, and naval infantry, who had never trained for land combat. The Navy men I can forget about, Steiner admitted bitterly. I bet they're great on ships, but they've never been trained for this kind of fighting. I have hardly any artillery, very few tanks, and only a few anti-aircraft guns. I'll tell you what I have. A completely mixed-up heap. HTD,